In the dense, shadowy woods of Vermont, a young couple sought solace and peace, deciding to rent a quaint house for what they hoped would be an idyllic getaway. The quiet surroundings, with their towering trees and whispering winds, seemed like the perfect escape from the bustling city life. The air was crisp with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil, while the late autumn leaves rustled softly underfoot. Everything about the place seemed serene and untouched, as if time itself moved slower here. But what they didn't realize was that this house, seemingly just another rural retreat, would soon become the setting for a horrifying series of events that would forever alter their views on the paranormal. Little did they know, their peaceful vacation would soon spiral into something far more sinister, leaving them questioning everything they thought they knew about the unseen world around them. Good evening, everyone. In today's episode, we're diving deep into a collection of spine-chilling Airbnb horror stories. These real accounts, gathered from people who've lived through unimaginable experiences, are sure to make you think twice before booking your next cozy cabin in the woods. If you love unsettling tales that keep you up at night, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And if you've ever had your own terrifying encounter, don't hesitate to share it with us. Your story might just be featured in one of our future episodes. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for some real horror. It happened a few Christmases ago. My friends and I had been looking for a break from the city, somewhere quiet where we could enjoy the holiday spirit without the crowds and noise. After some online searching, we found the perfect place, a charming Airbnb nestled in a rural area. It had everything we were looking for: space, privacy, and a reasonable price. The photos made it look like a winter wonderland, with a cozy fireplace and thick blankets of snow outside. But the one thing the listing hadn't mentioned, and we hadn't noticed until we arrived, was that the house sat directly across from a graveyard. Not just any graveyard either. This one looked ancient, the gravestones worn and weathered from years of exposure to the harsh Vermont elements. Some stones leaned precariously, their inscriptions barely legible. Others had sunk into the earth, forgotten and overgrown with weeds. Unease crept in the moment we stepped out of the car. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The graveyard, shrouded in mist, seemed to stretch out endlessly, its silence unnerving. We tried to laugh it off as we unpacked, chalking it up to the eeriness of being in a remote place at night. The house itself was quaint, with old wooden floors that creaked under our feet and large windows that allowed moonlight to spill into the rooms. It was the kind of place that felt both welcoming and unsettling at the same time, as though it held secrets in its very walls. After we settled in, unpacked our bags, and made ourselves comfortable, we decided to explore the area. There were a few other houses down the road, but most of the land around us was barren, save for a large field of tall, dry grass that swayed in the chilly wind. The graveyard, however, remained untouched by us. None of us were particularly eager to cross the road and explore it, not yet, anyway. It wasn't until our second night that the real unease began to set in. We had just finished dinner, and the sky outside had turned a deep, inky black. The only light came from the dim glow of the moon and the soft amber light from the kitchen window. The time was around 10:30 p.m. when one of my friends, Ryan, suggested we finally check out the graveyard. "We didn't come all the way out here just to avoid it," he said with a grin. It was a joke, but there was something unsettling in his tone that made the rest of us pause. After a brief discussion, two of our friends decided to stay behind in the house. They weren't interested in wandering through a graveyard at night, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. That left three of us, myself, Ryan, and Sarah, to go exploring. We found a flashlight, threw on our jackets, and crossed the street. The air was colder than it had been earlier, And as we approached the entrance to the graveyard, the temperature seemed to drop even further. I could feel the chills seeping into my bones, the kind of cold that made your teeth chatter despite the layers you wore. The moment we stepped through the rusted iron gate, I knew something was off. The atmosphere inside the graveyard felt different. It was quieter, somehow, as though the very air had stilled. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows upon rows of old tombstones, some of which were so worn that they were little more than slabs of stone. We walked slowly between the graves, our footsteps muffled by the dry leaves beneath our feet. There was something unnerving about reading the names etched into the stones, most of them belonging to people who had been dead for centuries. The years of their deaths ranged from the early 1800s to the mid-1900s, but there were no fresh graves. It was as though this place had been forgotten by time. The friend holding the flashlight, Ryan, wandered ahead, leaving Sarah and me in near complete darkness. I could feel Sarah tense beside me. The only sound was the crunch of leaves and the occasional gust of wind. That's when Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "I don't like this," she whispered. Before I could respond, she bolted forward, trying to catch up with Ryan and the flashlight. In her rush, she didn't see the gravestone in her path. She tripped over it, stumbling forward with a startled yelp. I rushed to her side, helping her up, but in her panic, she tripped again this time, falling hard onto the ground. Her hands scraped against the cold earth, and she let out a nervous laugh as I helped her to her feet. I'm fine, she insisted, but her voice was shaky. We all were. We decided to head back to the house, feeling more than a little unsettled. Nothing had happened, nothing tangible, anyway, but there was a heaviness in the air that none of us could shake. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I found myself sharing a room with Sarah. We both tried to laugh off the experience, but it lingered in the back of our minds. It was around 2 a.m. when Sarah suddenly shook me awake, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I blinked, groggy and confused. "Hear what?" "The knocking," she said, her voice trembling. There was knocking on the window. I froze. The room was dark. The only sound, the faint rustle of wind outside. We stayed still, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing. But just as I was about to dismiss it as Sarah's imagination, I heard it a soft, rhythmic knock on the wall beside the bed. Not loud, but clear enough to make my heart race. We lay there in the darkness, too terrified to move, barely daring to breathe. The knocking came again, this time from the bed frame. 2 sharp, deliberate knocks that sent a chill down my spine. Without thinking, we jumped out of bed and rushed to wake the others. We told them what had happened, but they were skeptical, groggy from sleep, and unconvinced that anything supernatural was at play. For the rest of the night, nothing else happened. But Sarah and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, something unseen and unfriendly. Even now, years later, the memory of those knocks makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That same winter, another couple had their own terrifying experience in a remote Vermont cabin. They had rented a small, isolated house just before the pandemic hit, hoping for a peaceful retreat in nature. But their vacation quickly turned into a nightmare they would never forget. The couple arrived after a long, scenic drive through small towns and snow-covered fields, their excitement mounting with each mile. The cabin was picturesque, tucked away in the woods, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It seemed perfect. But on their first night, as they lay in bed, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, so powerful it shook the walls. It sounded as though someone had kicked the front door with all their strength. Startled, They waited, listening for any further sounds. But there was only silence. The next morning, they discovered a dent in the front door, but no tracks, no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused it. As the days went on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, until by their final night, they were too terrified to stay any longer. By 2:30 a.m., they packed up and left, too afraid to look back. So, a poltergeist infestation might be a plausible explanation for what we experienced. It's not surprising that no one else mentioned this situation in the reviews of the rental. After all, the owners review their guests too, and nobody wants to be blacklisted from booking future stays. I'm no exception. This place serves as a strong reminder that when you're out for a walk at night, that eerie feeling of being watched from the tree line beyond the cobblestone fence isn't always just an animal or your mind playing tricks on you. Sometimes, there's something more. In October 2017, my band and I were halfway through a 2-month tour across Europe. We had been performing in different cities, meeting fans, and enjoying the journey. But there's one experience during that tour that will stay with me forever. Even now, years later, I can't fully understand or explain what took place. It still doesn't make sense to me. There were 4 of us crammed into a Honda Jazz, driving around Europe with all our musical equipment, clothes, and whatever else we could fit in the tiny car. Some of the venues where we played, including this one, offered free accommodations on top of paying us. After spending up to 9 hours in that cramped car, we weren't about to refuse any offer for a free place to stay. Some of my bandmates were excited to explore the local nightlife and check out what the town had to offer. But me? I was exhausted. All I wanted was a quiet night to lie down, relax, and maybe scroll through my phone until I fell asleep. The tour was nearly over, and I felt drained, in need of some peace. The place where we were staying was a modern Airbnb in Zurich. We expected a basic room with a bed and a bathroom, but what we walked into felt more like a high-end apartment than a typical rental. The apartment had stylish furniture, a king-sized bed in each of the 2 bedrooms, and even a jacuzzi. The kitchen was spacious, complete with beautiful wooden floors that stretched through the open-concept living area. It was honestly more than we ever expected for the price. I opted to sleep in the living area on my inflatable mattress. It was centrally located, connecting the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom, and I didn't mind the idea of having more space to myself. While the others got ready to hit the town, I noticed a leaflet on the kitchen table. It mentioned that the building had been standing since 1260, though you wouldn't have known it based on how modern everything looked. The renovations had completely masked any sign of the building's ancient history. I said goodbye to my bandmates as they headed out, one of them joking about taking a bath when they got back later that night. I had the entire place to myself, and I was more than happy to have a quiet night of rest. After scrolling through my phone for a bit, I quickly drifted off to sleep. The sound of a dripping tap woke me. At first, I tried to ignore it, assuming that one of my bandmates had left the tap running after their bath. Annoyed, I glanced at the wall clock. It was 3:30 a.m. I tossed the blankets over my head, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. The constant drip was unrelenting. Suddenly, I felt something strange, a pressure at the foot of my bed. It felt like someone had pressed down hard on the mattress, as though they were sitting at the edge. My body tensed. It was an unnatural sensation, like a heavy weight that wasn't supposed to be there. It felt like being on a bouncy castle when someone jumps on it, sending a ripple of movement that bounces the opposite side. Only this time, the bed launched me slightly into the air. My heart began to pound. A cold wave of fear shot down my spine, and I stopped breathing for a moment, too terrified to move. I told myself it was just my imagination, But then the weight pressed down again. This time, it was more deliberate, like someone nudging me for attention. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was in the room with me. With every nerve on edge, I slowly pulled the blankets away and peered down toward the foot of the bed. At first, I saw nothing but the dim outlines of furniture in the room, bathed in the faint glow from the city lights outside. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark shape stood near the dining table, about 2 feet away from my bed. My breath caught in my throat. It was hard to make out, but it felt like someone or something was watching me. I blinked several times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the shape didn't disappear. There, standing motionless, was a girl. At least, it looked like a girl, though her features were indistinct. Her skin was pale, her long hair dripping wet and hanging down to her feet. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and unfeeling. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, and my voice failed me. Without thinking, I yanked the blanket over my head, squeezing my eyes shut. I told myself it was just a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I knew deep down that wasn't the case. I don't remember falling asleep, but the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the blinds. The room was filled with the warmth of morning, and the terrifying presence from the night before had vanished. I shot up from my bed, heart still pounding, and saw one of my bandmates, Ethan, sitting at the dining table, typing away on his laptop. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I practically ran over to him, desperate to tell him what had happened. But as I tried to explain, he just waved it off, dismissing my story as a bad dream. "You were probably overtired," he said, not even looking up from his screen. Nothing weird happened. That's when Gary, who had slept in one of the bedrooms, joined us. He walked into the kitchen looking pale, his movements sluggish and unsteady. I assumed he was hungover, but something about his expression seemed off. There was a hollow look in his eyes, like he had seen something terrible but wasn't ready to talk about it. Later, after we packed up, 2 of the guys went to get the car while Gary and I stayed behind to watch over our bags in the lobby. We sipped coffee, the unease from the night before still lingering in the back of my mind. I decided to ask Gary how he slept, expecting him to brush off the question or make a joke. But before I could even finish my sentence, he cut me off. "Mate, you wouldn't believe me if I told you." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at him for a moment, unsure if he was serious or just messing with me. But there was no humor in his eyes. He looked genuinely shaken. He went on to describe what had happened to him during the night. He said he felt someone climb into bed with him. At first, he thought it was one of the other band members pulling a prank. But when he turned over, there was no one there. Yet, he could still feel a cold, heavy presence lying beside him, as if someone invisible had slipped under the covers. The fear in his voice was palpable. He admitted that he had been too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Like me, he had pulled the blanket over his head and prayed that whatever was in the room would leave him alone. And like me, he hadn't taken the bath he had planned. We sat there in silence, both of us trying to process what had happened. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, but we knew something had shared that apartment with us. Something we couldn't see, couldn't explain, and couldn't forget. From that day on, we made a pact. No more haunted airbends. No more stays in buildings with too much history. We'd stick to modern hotels, where the only thing we'd have to worry about was the minibar bill. But every now and then, when the nights are quiet and the shadows start to creep, I think back to that Airbnb in Zurich and wonder if the girl with the long, wet hair is still there, waiting for her next guest.